Hey World War II enthusiasts, imagine the acrid tang of burning diesel searing your lungs as a Sherman tank erupts in flames, its crew scrambling into the Normandy mud, shadows against a dawn laced with gunfire. Tonight, we delve into that fragile world where American steel clashed with German behemoths in a dance of survival and shadow. Settle in, dim the lights, flick on a fan for that gentle hum, and let your body sink into the sheets as we step back to July 1944, feeling the damp chill of hedgerows and the weight of outmatched armor. If tales of grit and quiet heroism ease your mind, like and subscribe to join this journey. Share in the comments what city you're tuning from and the hour on your clock. It connects us across the night, like whispers over foxholes. Now, breathe deep. We're climbing inside. The mud clung to your boots like a reluctant lover, pulling you deeper into the earth with every step, as if Normandy itself whispered that you didn't belong here. It was July 1944, just weeks after the beaches had turned crimson under the Allied surge, and the air hung heavy with the damp breath of dawn. Thick, unyielding humidity laced with the sharp bite of gasoline fumes that stung your nostrils and coated your throat. You had crossed the channel on a heaving transport ship, your stomach churning with more than seasickness. And now, in this makeshift assembly area tucked behind the front lines, the world narrowed to rows of squat, olive-drab machines waiting silently under a grey sky that promised rain but delivered only unease. These were the M4 Shermans, not the snarling beasts of legend you'd heard about in training camps back home, but practical tin boxes on tracks, their high silhouettes rising awkwardly from the churned soil like overgrown farm tractors dressed for war. Yet, as you approached, a quiet dread settled in your chest, for these were the workhorses meant to carry you into the maw of German armor, where tigers and panthers lurked like shadows from ancient myths, their thick hides shrugging off blows that would shatter lesser foes. You paused, wiping sweat from your brow despite the chill, and let your gaze trace the lines of these tanks, dozens of them, arrayed in neat formations that belied the chaos they were built to endure. Their hulls gleamed faintly under a fresh coat of paint, but up close you saw the welds, the rivets, the unassuming 75mm guns poking forward like hesitant probes rather than the thunderous lances of their Teutonic counterparts. History would later tally them as the backbone of the Allied push, mass-produced miracles rolling off Detroit assembly lines at a rate that dwarfed anything the Reich could muster. Yet in that moment, they felt fragile, almost apologetic in their simplicity. A grizzled sergeant emerged from the shadows of one such machine, his face etched with lines that spoke of too many dawns like this, his uniform caked in the same mud that now claimed your souls. He eyed you with the weary detachment of a man who'd seen replacements come and go, then jabbed a greasy thumb toward the nearest Sherman. "That's lucky lady," he grunted, his voice a low rumble that carried the faint twang of some Midwestern town long forgotten. "Your new home, kid. Don't get too cozy. She's got a reputation." As he spoke, you climbed the side, your hands gripping the cool metal that hummed faintly with residual heat from the engines, and peered inside the hatch, where the interior yawned like a cramped metal womb painted stark white to chase away the gloom. But no paint could dispel the stories you'd heard whispered in barracks. Tales of Shermans brewing up in flames from a single hit, their ammo racks igniting like Roman candles, earning them the grim moniker Ronsons, after the lighters that promised to light every time. The sergeant noticed your hesitation, a wry twist curling his lip as he leaned in closer, his breath smelling of stale coffee and cigarettes, rationed too sparingly. "Yeah, the Krauts love 'em for that," he added, his tone dipping into that peculiar blend of resignation and dark amusement born from nights staring at death's ledger. "Burn so quick, you could roast bread for the whole platoon, if you're into charred crusts and a side of eternity." It was a joke, edged in shadow, the kind that bubbled up from the abyss of knowing your ride might double as your pyre. Yet it hung there, a fleeting spark in the dim light, reminding you that humor, however blackened, was the thin armor men wore against the inevitable. You slid down into the loader's station, the sling seat creaking under your weight, and felt the confines press in, levers and dials within arm's reach, the faint scent of oil mingling with the ghosts of previous crews. This was no fortress like the Tiger Naufrages, that 60-ton Leviathan you'd studied in grainy intelligence photos, its 80mm gun a spear forged in Hell's foundry, capable of piercing Allied hopes from a kilometre away. No, the Sherman was democracy on tracks, reliable in numbers, expendable in design, a testament to American ingenuity that churned out thousands while the Germans handcrafted their monsters in dwindling factories. Yet, as you ran your fingers over the breech of the 75mm cannon, adequate for infantry support but laughably outgunned against sloped Panther armor, a subtle irony surfaced in your thoughts, unbidden and wry. In a war where machines decided fates, yours was built to be replaced, much like the men who manned it, a cycle of production mirroring the endless churn of lives fed into the grinder. History whispered that this very vulnerability would turn the tide, sheer volume overwhelming quality. But here, in the mud, it felt like a cosmic jest, as if the gods of war chuckled at the audacity of sending tin cans against steel titans. The sergeant barked orders, pulling you from reverie, and you joined the ritual of preparation, checking fuel lines that snaked like veins through the hull, ensuring the radial engine, a right continental beast borrowed from aviation, purred without protest. Around you, other greenhorns stumbled similarly, clutching manuals that promised mastery but delivered only the basics: how to load shells without losing fingers, how to brace against the recoil that could shatter bones if you weren't careful. The air buzzed with subdued chatter, fragments of home drifting like smoke, letters from sweethearts tucked into pockets, dreams of apple pie clashing with the reality of sea rations that tasted of cardboard and regret. Yet beneath it all lingered that quiet observation, born from the edge of despair. These Shermans, with their high profiles inviting every pagan's aim, were like hopeful suitors in a ballroom of predators, stepping forward with optimism that bordered on folly. And as the first raindrops pattered against the hull, you wondered, in that still moment before the engines roared to life, how many such boxes had already vanished into the earth, their crews scattered like forgotten echoes. Deeper into the assembly yard, the contrast sharpened. You'd heard of tigers prowling the eastern front, kings of the battlefield with armor thick as castle walls. But here in the west, the panthers were the new nightmare. Sleek, predatory, their long 75mm KWK 42 guns outranging and outpunching anything the Allies fielded en masse. Your Sherman, by comparison, was a plucky underdog, its sloped front glacis offering some deflection, but nothing like the impenetrable hides across the lines. Engineers had rushed improvements, wet ammo storage to curb those infamous fires, upgunned variants with 76mm punch. But yours was a standard M4, reliable yet mortal, a symbol of the industrial might that would eventually bury the Axis under sheer weight. As the sergeant walked you through the basics, his voice a steady drone against the gathering storm, you caught glimpses of that wry fatalism again. "She'll get you where you need to go," he said, patting the turret like an old dog. "Just pray the tigers are napping when you arrive, or that they've run out of catnip." It was a fleeting barb, laced with the absurdity of pitting factory fodder against engineered perfection. Yet it underscored the quiet heroism of persistence, a thread weaving through the ages, reminding you that survival often hinged not on superiority, but on the stubborn refusal to yield. The day wore on, the mud deepening as trucks rumbled in with supplies, and you absorbed the data points that history would later dissect. Over 49,000 Shermans produced, dwarfing the mere 1,347 Tigers, a numerical deluge that flooded Europe with olive-drab hope. But statistics felt distant in the damp chill, where the real education came from the sergeant's tales of bocage ambushes, where visibility vanished in green walls, of panthers lurking like patient hunters. You climbed atop the turret, surveying the yard, and felt a pang of connection to those who'd come before, their sacrifices etched into the scarred landscape, a silent testament to resilience that echoed into your own era, where battles were fought in boardrooms or screens, yet the human cost of progress remained eerily familiar. As evening shadows lengthened, the Sherman loomed less as a machine and more as a vessel for stories untold. Its boxy form a canvas for the absurd tragedy of war, tin against titanium, flesh against fate. And in that hushed anticipation, you settled into your role, the loader's burden heavy yet profound, knowing that in this fragile shell, survival was not guaranteed, but the fight itself was a quiet defiance against the dark. You eased yourself through the hatch, the metal rim scraping against your shoulders like a reluctant embrace, and suddenly the world contracted into a dim, echoing chamber where every breath echoed back with the faint tang of oiled steel and lingering shadows. The Sherman's interior unfolded around you like a forgotten attic, painted in that stark white meant to banish the gloom, but only amplifying the sense of confinement, as if the designers had whispered a cruel promise of light in a place where true darkness dwelled in the mind. Linking the outer chaos of Normandy's mud to this inner sanctum was a narrow portal, and as you descended, the clamour of the assembly yard faded, replaced by the subtle creaks of the hull settling under its own weight. A quiet reminder that this machine, for all its mass-produced bravado, was as mortal as the men it sheltered. Yet, in that moment, as your eyes adjusted to the filtered light seeping through periscopes and slits, you felt the first stirrings of an unspoken pact, forged not in grand oaths, but in the shared compression of space and fate, where 5 souls would navigate the abyss together, their lives intertwined like wires in a jury-rigged fuse. First came Sarge, the commander, perched in his cupola like a weathered sentinel guarding a crumbling tower, his eyes carrying the permanent weariness of a man who'd stared too long into the horizon's maw. He was older than the rest, though war had a way of blurring ages, etching lines that spoke of lost farms back in Kansas, or wives waiting in vain for letters that grew scarcer with each push. His voice, when he spoke, was a low gravel, steady as the engine's idle hum, guiding you through the layout with the patience of one who'd buried too many predecessors. "Loader's spot is yours," he murmured, nodding toward the sling seat bolted near the breech, where shells waited in racks like silent sentinels of destruction. In his gaze lingered a quiet reflection, born from nights when the tank's thin walls amplified every distant boom, reminding him, and now you, that survival here was less about heroism and more about the mundane arithmetic of endurance, a lesson etched into history's ledger where countless crews had tallied their days not in victories, but in the simple miracle of dawn. And as he adjusted his helmet, scarred from shrapnel that had whispered too close, you sensed the wry undercurrent in his demeanor, that subtle acknowledgement of the absurdity, commanding a box that history would praise for its numbers, yet one that demanded you treat it like a lover prone to fiery betrayals. Beside him, the gunner from Iowa unfolded from his station like a root-bound plant stretching towards scant light, his hands steady as the flatlands he'd left behind, where endless fields had taught him the patience of seasons. He was a farm boy at heart, broad-shouldered and quiet, his fingers tracing the elevation wheels with the reverence one might reserve for ploughing furrows, turning the 75mm gun, a weapon adequate for shattering bunkers, but woefully outmatched against the sloped armor of panthers lurking in the bocage, into an extension of his will. "She kicks like a mule with opinions," he said softly, demonstrating the traverse, his voice carrying the faint drawl of cornfields under summer sun. In those hands lay the precision that could mean the difference between a glancing blow and oblivion, a fact woven into the fabric of Allied tactics, where Sherman swarmed like bees to overwhelm solitary German cats. Yet, as he wiped a lens with a rag that had seen better days, a fleeting thought surfaced in the quiet between words. The irony of a man raised on open skies now confined to peering through slits narrower than a confession booth, where every target acquired carried the weight of lives not his own, a desperate calculus that echoed into modern reflections on how progress often demanded such intimate sacrifices. Then there was the driver, a fast-talking whirlwind from Brooklyn, his words tumbling out like dice in a back alley game, filling the cramped space with the rhythm of city streets he'd traded for this rolling coffin. He slouched in his forward seat, fiddling with the levers that coaxed the right Continental engine to life, his complaints a steady undercurrent, about the mud that clogged the tracks, the heat that built like a simmering grudge, the way the Sherman wallowed through terrain better suited to tractors than tanks. "This baby's got heart, but legs like my Uncle Vinny after too many whiskeys," he quipped, his grin flashing in the dim light, a spark of levity that masked the deeper edge, the kind where humor clawed its way from the pit of knowing your ride's high profile made it a silhouette begging for a par 40's kiss. History noted drivers like him as the unsung pulse of armored warfare, navigating hedgerows that turned every turn into a gamble, their skills honed in urban chaos, now bent to evading ambushes where one wrong pivot could spell the end. And in his banter lay that organic wryness, a reflection whispered in the confines. The Sherman was tight as a sardine can, but hey, if it brewed up, at least they'd all cook evenly, like some twisted family reunion where the main course was regret. The bow gunner completed the circle, barely 19, his face still soft with the innocence of youth that war hadn't yet fully eroded, manning the hull machine gun with wide eyes that darted like fireflies in twilight. He was the youngest, fresh from training camps where simulations paled against the real symphony of shells whistling overhead. His role a frontline sentinel against infantry swarms that could swarm the tank like ants on a fallen giant. "Just keep feeding the belt straight," he mumbled during a quick drill, his voice trembling slightly, betraying the undercurrent of fear that history would later romanticize as valor. But here felt raw, a boy's grasp on manhood in a machine designed for mass death. Linking his nervousness to the group's quiet strength was the shared ritual of unpacking K-rations, where greasy spam and crackers became communion. fostering bonds that transcended ranks, much like how today's fleeting connections in digital voids pale against the forged steel of such camaraderie under duress. In his youthful glances lay a subtle observation, emerging unbidden. The tank's white walls promised clarity, yet they boxed in dreams that burned brighter outside. A desperate irony where confinement bred the fiercest loyalties. Together, you formed the crew, 5 men crammed into 6 square meters of fate's whimsy, where the Sherman's functional heart, its radial engine roaring with 400 horsepower, tracks grinding forward at a modest 25 miles per hour, became the backdrop for lives intersecting in profound, unspoken ways. The 75mm gun, that pea-shooter against Teutonic giants, demanded your rhythm as loader. Hoist, ram, brace, repeat, each shell a 15-pound prayer against the odds stacked by German engineering. As conversations ebbed in the lulls, drifting to homes left behind, or the absurdity of fighting in fields that once grew wheat, a deeper resonance emerged, linking past to present, the resilience of ordinary souls thrust into extraordinary moors, their quiet defiance a mirror to modern struggles, where survival often hinged on collective grit rather than solitary might. And in those moments, as the engine idled like a slumbering beast, you felt the melancholy weight. This tin can was no match for tigers in a fair fight, yet its crews endured through sheer multiplicity, a historical tide that washed over fortified shores, evoking gratitude for eras where such desperation forged the freedoms we now take as given. The bonds deepened subtly, like roots seeking water in parched soil, through shared silences as much as words, Sarge's steady gaze offering anchor, the gunner's calm precision inspiring trust, the driver's quips piercing the tension like pins in a balloon about to burst. Historical accounts would later highlight how Sherman crews, outnumbering their foes 5-1 in key battles, turned vulnerability into strategy, flanking and overwhelming where direct confrontation spelled doom. Yet here, in the whitewashed bowels, it felt predestined, a quiet fatalism where each man's quirk wove into the whole. The bow gunner's youthful energy fueling vigilance, your own hands learning the dance of shells with a loader's instinctive grace. And threading through it all was that undercurrent of wry desperation, surfacing in fleeting thoughts. The tank's mass production, a satirical nod to democracy's might, churning out expendables to bury the elite, a reflection that stirred empathy for those long gone, their echoes urging appreciation for the fragile peace of now. As night crept over the assembly area, the Sherman became a cocoon, its confines pressing yet protective, where fears whispered in the dark found solace in the proximity of brothers forged by circumstance. The air grew cooler, carrying the distant rumble of artillery like a lullaby from hell, and in that hush you pondered the profound irony. This machine, derided for its flaws, embodied the human spirit's tenacity, a vessel where survival wasn't about invincibility, but about the unyielding will to persist, linking the valor of 1944 to the quiet battles of today, where knowledge of such histories reminds us that endurance, however shadowed by dread, is the truest legacy. The rain fell in relentless sheets, turning the Normandy earth into a vast, indifferent slurry that swallowed tracks and spirits alike, as if the sky itself conspired to remind you that war wasn't always thunder, but often this slow erosion, drop by drop, until resolve wore thin like the armor plating you now called home. Days blurred into one another after that initial descent into the Sherman, the assembly yard fading behind as your platoon inched forward, or rather, waited, parked in sodden fields, where the bocage loomed like ancient sentinels guarding secrets better left buried. You learned quickly that combat's fury was rare. Instead, existence unfolded in the quiet grind of anticipation, where the right continental engine became your fickle companion, its 9 cylinders humming fitfully beneath the hull, demanding constant vigilance lest a clogged filter or fouled spark plug strand you in no man's land. Mornings began with the ritual of cranking it to life, the starter whining like a reluctant child dragged from sleep, and as the radial beast coughed and settled into its rhythm, you felt the vibration through your bones, a subtle tremor that mirrored the unease pooling in your gut. History's footnotes would later praise this engine's aviation roots for reliability, yet here it felt like borrowing wings for a creature doomed to crawl. Linking one monotonous hour to the next was the ceaseless task of maintenance, your hands growing calloused from wrenching bolts and wiping grease that seemed to seep from the machine's very pores, as though the Sherman wept oil in quiet protest against its lot. Sarge oversaw it all with that steady gaze, directing you to check the fuel lines snaking through compartments where vulnerability hid in plain sight. The ammo racks stacked perilously along the sides, ready to turn a glancing hit into an inferno that history documented with chilling frequency. Over 80% of Sherman losses traced to those catastrophic brews. You hoisted shells into place, each one a heavy promise of violence deferred, their brass casings cold against your palms. And in those moments of labor, a quiet reflection surfaced. The tank's design, born from urgent wartime factories churning out thousands monthly, embodied a democratic fatalism. Quantity over invincibility. Lives stacked like those very rounds, expendable in the grand arithmetic that would one day claim victory through sheer persistence. Yet, as you braced against the hull's sway, the rain pattering like impatient fingers on the turret, you pondered how such endurance echoed into quieter battles of your own time, where modern burdens ground away at the soul, demanding the same unyielding grit without the glory. The gunner's station drew you next, where the Iowa farm boy methodically cleaned the 75mm barrel, his cloth gliding along the rifling with the deliberate care of a man polishing heirlooms from a life left behind. He worked in near silence, the only sound the soft rasp of fabric on steel, but occasionally he'd pause, peering down the bore as if gazing into some distant horizon where fields stretched unbroken, and murmur something low, almost to himself. "At least if she cooks off in here," he said once, his voice a whisper laced with that peculiar resignation born from staring at powder kegs day after day. We'd save on fireworks for Christmas, bright enough to light up the whole damn front. It was a fleeting thought, emerging like smoke from a spent casing, the kind where desperation twisted into wry acceptance, acknowledging the absurdity of cradling death so closely while dreaming of holiday lights back home. History whispered that such routines saved lives, the barrel's cleanliness ensuring shells flew true when the moment demanded. Yet in the dim confines, it felt like tending a fickle oracle, one that could prophesy salvation or sudden end with equal indifference. And as you assisted, swabbing residue that clung like regrets, you felt the melancholy pull. These acts of care, mundane as they were, wove a fragile web against chaos, much like how today's rituals of maintenance, from oil changes to mental reprieves, stave off breakdowns in lives far removed from foxholes. Deeper into the weight, the bowgunner fidgeted with his .30 caliber mount, feeding belts of ammunition that clink softly like chains binding you to this limbo, his youthful hands trembling not from cold, but from the weight of idleness that amplified every distant rumble. Artillery echoed faintly from the horizon, a low growl that teased without delivering, linking your stasis to the broader symphony of invasion, where Allied forces inched through hedgerows at a cost of blood and patience. You joined him in inspecting the hull's vulnerabilities, tracing welds that history critiqued for their thinness, barely 2 inches in places, sloped for deflection, but no match for the 80mm shells that Tigers hurled like divine judgments. The rain intensified, drumming a hypnotic rhythm on the glacis plate, and in that auditory haze reflections drifted. The Sherman's quirks, its squeals and shudders when idling, mirrored the human frailty within, a machine prone to overheating just as crews simmered with unspoken fears, yet enduring through collective resolve that paralleled modern tales of quiet perseverance amid uncertainty. Sarge would circle during these lulls, his boots squelching in the mud outside, peering in with a nod that conveyed more than words. These weights were the true forge, tempering men into units where survival hinged on the unremarkable, the overlooked acts that history glossed over in favor of dramatic clashes. As afternoon bled into evening, the tasks cycled endlessly, draining water from fuel sumps to prevent the engine sputter, tightening track pins that loosened in the mire like resolve fraying under strain. The driver from Brooklyn grumbled through it, his hands blackened as he adjusted the transmission, linking complaints to the tank's personality. A wallower in mud, sluggish on the inclines, yet doggedly forward when coaxed. She's like that dame who promises the world, but delivers a headache, he'd mutter. But beneath the quip lay the deeper edge, an acknowledgement that this weight, this tedium, was war's slyest weapon, eroding morale as surely as rust claimed untreated steel. Historical records would tally Sherman's mobility as a key asset, covering ground where heavier foes bogged down. But in the downpour, it felt predestined, a slow marination in dread that cultivated empathy for those ensnared in similar holds today, where waiting rooms or endless queues test the spirit's mettle. You wiped condensation from the periscopes, peering into a blurred world of green and grey, the fear not of action, but of its absence, where imagination painted horrors more vivid than reality, stirring gratitude for eras where such pauses allow reflection rather than ruin. Night descended, the rain easing to a drizzle that whispered against the hull like forgotten confessions, and you huddled inside, the white walls glowing faintly under a hooded lamp that cast long shadows across the racks. Maintenance wrapped with the checking of seals on hatches prone to leaks, ensuring the interior stayed dry against the encroaching damp that mirrored the seep of anxiety into thoughts. In these hours, conversations turned inward, fragments of home surfacing like buoys in a stormy sea. Letters read by flashlight, dreams of normalcy clashing with the tank's confined reality. The gunner polished one last tool, his movements deliberate, and in the quiet, that wry undercurrent emerged again. The engine's hum, reliable yet thirsty for fuel that supply lines strained to deliver, felt like life's own engine, demanding upkeep amid scarcity. A subtle parallel to contemporary struggles where resources dwindle yet persistence prevails. As sleep tugged at the edges, the Sherman stood sentinel in the dark, its presence a cocoon of steel and vulnerability, linking your vigil to the timeless human saga of waiting, patient, profound, and laced with the quiet strength that history honors in hushed tones. The distant thunder of artillery rolled in like a forgotten promise, low and insistent, linking the endless wait to some unseen cataclysm just beyond the hedgerows, where the war raged in earnest, while your world simmered in suspended animation. As the days stretched, the rain gave way to a cloying mist that clung to everything, veiling the bocage in ethereal shrouds that blurred the line between vigilance and hallucination, as if Normandy's landscape itself conspired to erode the edges of your sanity. You found yourself drawn back to the engine's underbelly, probing the fuel system for contaminants that could stall the right Continental at the worst moment. Your fingers numb from the chill seeping through the hull's thin skin. A mere 2 inches of rolled homogeneous armor in places, sloped for deflection, but whispering vulnerability with every creak under pressure. History would later quantify this fragility, noting how Shermans, despite their mechanical resilience, succumbed to fires in 3 out of 4 penetrations due to those side-mounted ammo bins. Yet in the fog-shrouded field, it felt like tending a slumbering dragon prone to self-immolation, its breath a faint rumble that echoed the crew's own suppressed anxieties. Linking one idle hour to the next, the bow gunner took to recalibrating his sights, his young eyes straining through the periscope at a world reduced to slivers of green and grey, where every rustle might herald an ambush or merely the wind mocking your isolation. He worked with a focus that bordered on obsession, adjusting for the tank's subtle list in the mud, a quirk born from tracks that bogged down faster than the heavier Tigers, those German monoliths whose interleaved road wheels chewed through terrain with predatory grace. You assisted, holding tools steady as he muttered calculations, and in those shared silences, a subtle undercurrent surfaced. The irony of waiting in a machine built for mobility, yet chained by the very earth it sought to conquer, much like how modern pursuits often mire us in delays despite promises of speed, demanding a patience forged in historical crucibles where survival rewarded the steadfast. The mist thickened, diffusing the light into a hazy glow that bathed the interior in pallid uncertainty, amplifying the sense of predestination. This limbo was not mere pause, but the war's sly forge, tempering nerves against the inevitable shatter. Sarge circled the hull during these lulls, his boots leaving deep imprints in the softening ground, inspecting seals on hatches that wept condensation like unspoken regrets, ensuring no moisture corrupted the electricals that could short out at a critical juncture. He moved with the deliberate economy of experience, his gravel voice offering sparse guidance. Tighten that fitting before it bites back. And as you knelt beside him, wrestling a stubborn bolt, he paused, wiping his brow with a rag that had absorbed more grime than any cloth should bear. "She shudders like a bride on her wedding night," he said softly, his eyes distant, fixed on some invisible horizon where the bocage met the sky. "But at least she doesn't bolt, unlike some recruits who've eyed the rear lines like lovers in waiting." It was a murmur laced with that shadowed amusement, emerging from the well of knowing how thin the veil between duty and desertion truly was, a reflection that hung in the damp air like the mist itself, underscoring the absurd fidelity demanded by this olive-drab cage amid fields that once nurtured life rather than devour it. Deeper into the routine, the gunner from Iowa turned his attention to the turret traverse, oiling gears that groaned under the weight of the 75mm cannon, a weapon whose muzzle velocity clocked at 2,030 feet per second, respectable for shredding infantry positions, but a feeble protest against the Panther's frontal glasses, angled to deflect shots like disdainful glances. You handed him the grease gun, watching as he applied it with the precision of a surgeon, and in the rhythmic squeak of metal yielding to lubricant, thoughts drifted to the historical disparity. Tigers, with their Maybach V12s delivering 700 horsepower, prowled with a durability that Shermans countered only through sheer numbers, a tidal wave of 49,000 units crashing against the Reich's elite few. Yet, as the mist swirled outside, veiling potential threats in ambiguity, you felt the melancholy resonance. These acts of care, repetitive as prayer, mirrored the human capacity for persistence, linking the quiet fortitude of 1944 crews to contemporary souls navigating uncertainties where knowledge of past trials illuminates paths through present fogs, evoking a profound gratitude for the relative clarity of hindsight. The driver, ever the restless spirit, filled the gaps with his own brand of upkeep, crawling beneath the hull to clear mud from the bogies, his curses muffled by the earth as he scraped away clots that could seize the suspension mid-maneuver. Linking his labour to the group's collective sigh was the shared awareness of the tank's thirst. Guzzling 0.6 gallons per mile on roads, more in the quagmire, demanding supply lines that stretched thin across liberated but battered France. He emerged smeared in filth, wiping his hands on trousers already beyond salvation. And in his exasperated huff lay that organic wryness. The Sherman, for all its wallowing, pressed on where flashier beasts might falter, a satirical nod to how quantity's humble grind often outlasted quality's grandeur. A lesson etched into war's annals where survival favoured the adaptable over the invincible. The mist began to lift slightly, revealing snatches of the bocage's labyrinthine walls. And in that partial unveiling, fear stirred. Not sharp, but a dull ache, like a bruise forming beneath the skin, reminding you of the destined confrontation lurking just beyond this interminable pause. As evening encroached once more, the tasks wound down, leaving you to contemplate the ammo racks anew, their contents arranged with meticulous care to mitigate the ever-present spectre of detonation, a historical plague that claimed countless crews before wet storage innovations curbed the flames. You traced the labels on high explosive rounds, feeling their latent fury hum beneath your fingertips, and in the fading light filtering through slits, reflections pooled. The weight's true cruelty lay in its amplification of doubts, where idle minds conjured horrors more vivid than any battlefield. Much like how today's prolonged uncertainties breed inner tempests that knowledge of historical resilience can calm. Sarge lit a cigarette outside, the glow a fleeting beacon in the gloam, and as you joined him for a moment's respite, the air carried the faint scent of wet earth and diesel, a sensory anchor to this limbo where endurance was not glamour, but the quiet accumulation of moments survived. The artillery's rumble faded to a whisper, linking your vigil to the broader tapestry of invasion, where such pauses forge the unyielding spirit that history reveres, stirring empathy for those ensnared in similar holds across time, and a quiet thankfulness for the freedoms born from their shadowed perseverance. Night fully claimed the field, the mist condensing on the hull like tears unshed, and inside the Sherman, the crew settled into watchful repose, the engine's residual warmth a faint comfort against the encroaching chill. You lay back against the sling, eyes tracing the white ceiling's faint cracks, and felt the sadness deepen. A silent fear not of death's sudden arrival, but of its patient stalking, woven into the fabric of this weight, where every unchecked bolt or overlooked leak could unravel the fragile thread of tomorrow. Yet, in that hushed confinement, the wry undercurrent persisted. The tank's vulnerabilities, so glaring in blueprints, demanded a vigilance that elevated the mundane to the profound, a historical irony where weakness bred strength, echoing into eras where similar paradoxes define human tenacity, fostering a profound sense of connection to the past's quiet warriors. The order came like a whisper from fate's shadowed lips, slicing through the monotonous haze of waiting as your platoon lurched forward into the bocage's embrace. The Sherman's tracks grinding against the earth with a reluctant growl that echoed the unease knotting in your chest. The mist had lifted just enough to reveal the labyrinth ahead. Ancient hedgerows rising like verdant walls, thick and tangled, their roots delving deep into soil soaked with centuries of quiet strife, now awakened to swallow machines and men alike. You gripped the loader's perch, the sling seat swaying gently as the tank navigated the narrow lanes, visibility reduced to mere glimpses through the periscopes, where every break in the green promised peril or passage in equal measure. History would later frame this terrain as a defender's dream, the bocage's dense barriers channeling Allied armor into kill zones, where German anti-tank guns waited like patient spiders, their 75mm Pak 40s capable of punching through your hull from 500 yards with surgical disdain. Yet in that moment, as the engine's hum blended with the distant chatter of small arms, it felt predestined, a slow unraveling where the Sherman's high silhouette bobbed like a target in a carnival game, inviting shots from shadows the designers never truly accounted for. Suddenly, the world shattered. A deafening crack split the air, sharper than thunder and closer than breath, as the tank lurched violently sideways, the impact reverberating through the hull like a giant's fist slamming against tin. Shrapnel pinged off the glacis plate, and for an instant, time fractured, your ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out Sarge's initial shout, the acrid scent of cordite seeping in like an uninvited ghost. It was a German anti-tank gun, hidden in the foliage's deceitful folds, its shell glancing off, but close enough to rattle bones and resolve alike. Chaos erupted in practiced fragments. Sarge's voice cut through the din, gravelly and unyielding, barking coordinates that seemed pulled from some inner map etched by prior survivals. Traverse right, elevation down, load smoke. Linking the crew's disjointed panic into a symphony of motion, you moved on instinct, hoisting a smoke shell from the rack, with hands that trembled not from fear, but from the adrenaline's cold surge, slamming it into the breach with a metallic thunk that resonated like a heartbeat, amplified in the confined space. The gunner from Iowa twisted the wheels, his farm-steady fingers aligning the 75mm tube toward the unseen threat, while the driver from Brooklyn threw the levers into reverse, the Sherman scraping against a stone wall embedded in the hedgerow, sparks flying like fleeting stars in the dim interior. Linking survival to split-second harmony, another Sherman from the platoon edged forward on your flank, its turret swiveling to draw fire. A selfless dance where numbers compensated for individual frailty. History's brutal equation playing out in real time as Allied tactics relied on such mutual sacrifice to overwhelm entrenched foes. You fired blind into the thick green wall, the cannon's recoil shoving the tank backward with a grunt, smoke rounds bursting ahead in billowing clouds that veiled the lane like a mourner's shroud, obscuring the enemy's sightlines while buying precious seconds. The bow gunner unleashed bursts from his 30 cal, tracers arcing into the foliage like angry fireflies, suppressing shadows that might harbor infantry with Panzerfaust. Those rocket-propelled nightmares that could turn your tin can into a pyre from 100 yards. Amid the cacophony, a wry thought flickered in the haze of desperation. You'd just waltzed with death in this verdant ballroom, and luckily, he tripped on his own tango steps, his aim faltering in the smoke's deceptive embrace, a fleeting irony that underscored the absurd lottery of survival where one misplaced shell could rewrite destinies in flames. The ambush intensified Another round whistling past close enough to feel its heat through the hull, the Sherman shuddering as if protesting its own vulnerability, its thin sides, barely proof against such calibrated hatred, reminding you of the historical toll where over 4,000 Shermans would fall in Europe, many to these hidden guns that turned advances into graveyards. Sarge leaned into the cupola, exposed yet unflinching, calling adjustments that wove the crew's efforts into a tapestry of defiance, his voice a steady anchor amid the storm. You reloaded swiftly, fingers aching from the shell's weight, each one a 15-pound talisman against oblivion. And as the gun boomed again, high explosive this time, splintering branches and silencing the enemy's retort, you felt the melancholy undercurrent. These moments of fury, rare interruptions in the tedium, forged bonds unbreakable, much like how contemporary crises test collective mettle, drawing strength from shared peril in ways that echo across eras, evoking a profound thankfulness for the relative safety of hindsight's vantage. Escape came not in triumph, but in incremental retreats, the driver maneuvering the tank backward through the lane's choke, wheels churning mud into froth as the flanking Sherman laid down suppressive fire, its own cannon barking in solidarity. The anti-tank gun fell silent, perhaps destroyed or withdrawn, history silent on such minutiae, but clear on the broader cost. Bocage fighting claimed tanks by the dozen daily, forcing adaptations like rhino cutters welded to hulls to breach the green walls. You exhaled shakily in the aftermath, the interior thick with spent powder's bite, ears still throbbing from the blasts. And as the platoon regrouped in a safer clearing, no cheers rose, only the collective hush of breaths reclaimed, a quiet acknowledgement that survival was not victory but a deferred sentence. Sarge slumped slightly, wiping sweat that mingled with grime, his eyes scanning the crew with that paternal scrutiny, linking the ordeal to the inexorable push where such brushes with annihilation tempered men into instruments of persistence. In the fading echoes, reflections pooled like rainwater in craters. The chaos had been a frantic ballet, each role pivotal in the dance of evasion, where Sherman's agility, faster than the lumbering tiger, offered slim margins that history credited for turning tides in hedgerow hell. Yet the fear lingered, not of the fight itself, but of its intimacy, where death's brush left invisible scars, stirring empathy for those who danced similar steps in forgotten wars, and a subtle gratitude for presence where such dances are metaphors rather than mandates. The tank idled, its vibrations a soothing rumble now, and as night encroached once more, you pondered the wry essence emerging from the smoke. You'd survived the opening act, but the bocage's script promised encores, a destined cycle where endurance was the only curtain call. The bocage unfolded around you like a living enigma, its hedgerows rising as ancient barriers woven from earth and thorn, dense walls that seemed to breathe with the land's own pulse, trapping light and sound in their verdant clutches until the world shrank to a claustrophobic whisper. As the Sherman rumbled deeper into this green labyrinth, the lanes narrowed to mere slits carved through centuries-old embankments, where roots twisted like forgotten regrets beneath the soil, and every turn felt like delving into a maze crafted by indifferent gods to test the hubris of invaders. Visibility dissolved into fragments, glimpses through the driver's slit or the periscope's narrow eyes, where the tank's high profile loomed awkwardly, a silhouette begging for attention in terrain that favored the low and the hidden. History would later dissect this landscape as a natural fortress for the defenders, the bocage's sunken roads channeling Allied armor into predictable funnels, where German positions waited with pre-sighted guns, turning advances into ambushes that claimed tanks by the score in those early July weeks. Yet, as the engine's growl echoed off the earthen walls, it felt destined, a slow immersion into a realm where the Sherman's strengths, its speed on open ground, its mechanical reliability, twisted into liabilities, the machine's tall stance rising like a proud fool in a court of cunning shadows. Linking one confined stretch to the next, Sarge perched in the cupola, his upper body exposed to the fickle air, scanning the impenetrable green for signs of movement that might betray a sniper's nest, or the glint of a Panzerfaust tube peeking from the foliage. He stood there, binoculars pressed to eyes that had learned to pierce the veil of deception, but the act itself carried the weight of vulnerability, a commander's necessity in this blindfolded dance, where the tank's limited optics demanded human risk to navigate the twists. You watched from below, the interior's white walls closing in like a judgmental gallery, and felt the tension coil in your gut as branches scraped the hull, their touch a mocking caress that amplified the sense of entrapment. The Panzerfaust, that handheld harbinger with its shaped charge capable of piercing 200 mm of armor at 60 yards, loomed in every rustle, a historical spectre that felled countless Shermans in these confines, forcing crews to adapt with desperate ingenuity like welding improvised cutters to breach the barriers. In those moments of strained silence, a wry reflection drifted unbidden. These hedgerows, so protective in peacetime for the farms they bordered, now guarded secrets with a mother-in-law's deceptive warmth, always shielding, yet poised to stab from behind when least expected, a fleeting irony born from the desperation of peering into the unknown, where survival hinged on anticipating betrayal from the very earth. Deeper into the maze, the Sherman struggles manifested in subtle protests, the suspension groaning as it navigated ruts hidden beneath the overgrowth, the tracks slipping on slick banks that turned every maneuver into a gamble against bogging down. You braced against the turret ring, feeling the vibrations travel up your spine like unspoken warnings, while the gunner adjusted his sights futilely against the encroaching green that swallowed horizons whole. Poor visibility wasn't mere inconvenience. It was a psychological sieve, draining confidence drop by drop, where the tank's high turret, designed for open fields, now elevated it into a target silhouette against the skyline, inviting fire from positions that history recorded as masterful defenses, like the 352nd Infantry Division's entrenched lines that bloodied the Allies at Omaha and beyond. Linking this isolation to the crew's quiet vigilance, the bow gunner peered through his slit, his youthful breath fogging the glass, and in the stifled air, thoughts turned inward. The bocage's challenges mirroring life's own tangled paths, where progress demands navigating blind turns with a fortitude that echoes across time, stirring a melancholy gratitude for eras where such mazes are metaphorical, navigated with the hindsight of historical lessons rather than raw instinct. The psychological strain deepened with each kilometer claimed, the constant uncertainty weaving a tapestry of dread where hidden dangers lurked not just in the shadows, but in the mind's fertile imaginings, amplifying every unexplained snap or distant echo into harbingers of doom. Sarge's exposure in the hatch embodied this toll, his silhouette a defiant yet fragile sentinel, risking the sniper's bullet or the rocket's kiss to guide the blind beast forward. A role that history lauded in memoirs but felt here as a destined sacrifice, where leadership meant bearing the brunt of the unknown. You loaded a shell idly during a brief halt, the brass cool against your palms, the fear not explosive but insidious, an erosion that gnawed at resolve, much like how modern anxieties burrow in the quiet hours, demanding a resilience forged in similar crucibles of patience and peril. As the tank crept onward, the hedgerows pressing closer like judgmental whispers, a subtle observation emerged from the depths. The Sherman's unsuitability for this terrain was almost poetic. A machine born for vast plains now stumbling through a garden of deceptions, where endurance became the quiet rebellion against an environment that mocked mechanical might with organic cunning. Afternoon light filtered through the canopy in dappled patches, casting fleeting illusions of openness that vanished around the next bend, where the lane twisted sharply, forcing the driver to ease the Sherman through with painstaking care, the hull scraping against earthen banks that crumbled like fragile alliances. This terrain, sculpted by generations of farmers for defense against winds and foes alike, now turned its purpose against you, the high banks providing perfect cover for ambushes that history tallied in grim statistics. Over 500 tanks lost in the bocage's first month, many to infantry weapons that exploited the blindness. Linking the physical strain to the mental, you wiped sweat from your brow, the interior growing stifling as the sun baked the steel, and pondered the destined irony. In a war of movement, this green cage immobilized the mobile, demanding adaptations that tested human ingenuity, echoing into present reflections where environmental hurdles demand similar creativity, evoking empathy for those who navigated such literal mazes with a fortitude that built the freedoms we inherit. As dusk approached, the bocage's shadows lengthened, merging walls into an indistinct haze where threats blended seamlessly with the landscape, amplifying the sense of being ensnared in a web spun by the land itself. Sarge lowered himself briefly, his face etched with the day's quiet toll, and in the shared glance among the crew, fear lingered not as panic, but as a deep-seated ache, a companion in the confinement, where every unseen corner whispered potential end. The tank halted for the night in a rare clearing, its presence a defiant intrusion, and as you settled into watch, the night's chill seeped in, carrying the subtle wryness of reflection. These hedgerows, so unyielding, mirrored life's own barriers, where progress often came at the cost of exposure, a historical parallel that stirred profound sympathy for the ensnared souls of 1944, and a hushed appreciation for the open paths of today. The hedgerows pressed inward, like the walls of a breathing tomb, their earthen bulk rising sheer and unyielding, trapping the Sherman in a corridor where the sky narrowed to a sliver overhead, as if the land itself conspired to entomb you alive within your own steel skin. Each advance felt like probing a vein in some colossal organism, the tank's hull scraping against the banks with a grating sigh that reverberated through the interior, amplifying the sense of confinement until the white-painted walls seemed to pulse with your collective heartbeat. You shifted in the loader's sling, the canvas biting into your thighs, and peered through the narrow vision slit at a world fractured into glimpses, shadows flickering where branches met soil, every anomaly a potential harbinger woven into the bocage's deceptive tapestry. History etched this terrain as a fatal mismatch for the invaders. The Normans' ancient fields, divided for centuries to shield crops from wind, now shielding Wehrmacht positions that turned the Allies' mechanical superiority into a lumbering liability, with Shermans falling at rates that dwarfed open field engagements, their profiles too tall for the sunken paths carved by time's indifferent hand. Yet, as the engine strained against another incline, it felt inexorable, a destined plunge into obscurity where the machine's very design mocked your entrapment, its high stance elevating you not to dominance but to exposure. like a figurehead on a ship sailing blind into fog-shrouded reefs. Linking one shadowed bend to the next, uncertainty gnawed at the edges of perception. The corners ahead curving sharply into voids where hidden dangers lurked like unspoken doubts, ready to erupt from the underbrush or a camouflaged emplacement. Sarge's voice filtered down from the cupola, clipped and vigilant, directing the driver to ease around obstacles that history later revealed as pre-planned kill zones, where German paratroopers, veterans of Crete and Russia, melded with the landscape, their MG-42s and Faust poised to exploit the Sherman's blind spots. You braced as the tank tilted, the suspension creaking under the strain, and felt the psychological vice tighten, the not knowing a heavier burden than any shell, where imagination painted ambushes more vivid than reality, eroding the thin veneer of composure that separated action from paralysis. The Tiger, by contrast, prowled these paths with a lower grace, its interleaved wheels and squat turret, hugging the contours like a predator born to the hunt, history favoring its design in close quarters, where the Sherman's elevation turned advantage to curse, forcing crews to innovate with desperation-forged tools like cooling cutters to hack through the green. In the stifled air, as sweat beaded despite the chill seeping through vents, a quiet reflection surfaced. The bocage's twists mirrored life's own labyrinths, where unseen turns demand a fortitude that echoes through ages, stirring a melancholic appreciation for presence, where paths, though tangled, rarely conceal such lethal surprises. Deeper strains emerged in the relentless enclosure, the tank's unsuitability for this fractured ground, manifesting in every jolt that rattled the ammo racks, their contents shifting with ominous clinks that whispered of internal betrayals waiting to ignite. The gunner adjusted his optics futilely against the encroaching dusk, the periscopes offering only taunting fragments of the outside world, where a sniper's scope or an anti-tank mine could lurk in the ruts. History tallying such perils in the thousands of casualties that marked the hedgerow campaign's bloody arithmetic. You loaded a practice round during a brief pause, the shells weight a tangible anchor amid the intangible dread, like groundwater rising in a forgotten well, flooding the mind with what-ifs that no armor could deflect. Sarge ducked low for a moment, his face etched with the day's accumulated shadows, and murmured something about the Sherman's plight in this green snare, his words carrying that shadowed edge born from nights of similar vigils. It lumbered through like a bear crammed into a wardrobe, bulky and bold, yet utterly stuck when the door swung shut, a fleeting musing that captured the absurdity of pitting open-field engineering against nature's cunning fortifications, where desperation birthed a wry acceptance of the mismatched contest. The pressure mounted with each unyielding wall, the bocage's organic defenses, roots and thorns interlocking like fate's own knots, defying the mechanical intruder, where the tank's tracks churned futilely against banks that crumbled just enough to impede but not yield. Linking this physical impasse to the mental was the constant hum of vigilance, the bow gunner's breaths quickening as he scanned for infantry shadows that could swarm from the flanks, armed with weapons that history innovated in haste, like the Panzerfaust's one-shot lethality that turned foot soldiers into tank slayers. You felt the confinement acutely now, the interior's confines pressing like judgmental echoes, where the Sherman's design, optimized for production and speed, faltered in this intimate arena, demanding adaptations that tested human limits, much like how contemporary challenges force ingenuity from constraint, evoking empathy for those who forged ahead through literal thickets, their legacy a testament to resilience that illuminates our own navigations. as twilight bled into the greenery, casting elongated phantoms across the path. The fear settled not as terror, but as a profound ache, a companion in the dim where every unseen threat whispered of mortality's quiet inevitability. Night's veil descended fully, the hedgerows merging into an indistinct barrier that amplified isolation. The tank halting in a precarious nook, where the engine's idle thrum blended with the night's subtle symphony of rustles and distant booms. Sarge maintained his watch, silhouetted against the fading light, his exposure a silent defiance against the maze's grip, where snipers, perched in treetops or burrowed in banks, waited with patience honed by prior campaigns, history painting them as ghosts in the Allied advance that stalled for weeks amid these walls. You leaned against the breach, the metal cool and unyielding, and pondered the destined mismatch, the bocage not merely terrain, but a metaphor for entrapment, where mechanical might bow to organic guile, stirring a gratitude for eras where such snares are navigated with knowledge rather than blood, fostering a deep connection to the past's ensnared warriors whose quiet perseverance carved paths to freer tomorrows. In the hushed confines, as stars pierced the canopy like distant hopes, the wry essence persisted. The Sherman, so ill-suited here, persisted through sheer stubbornness, a satirical salute to how vulnerability often outmaneuvers strength in the long weave of survival's tapestry. The road curved gently out of the bocage's grasp, emerging into a stretch where the hedgerows thinned like reluctant curtains parting on a stage set for tragedy. And there, tilted into a roadside ditch, sat the remnant of another Sherman, its form twisted in silent agony as flames licked upward in greedy tongues. Black smoke billowed thick and oily, coiling into the afternoon sky, like the exhaled breath of some infernal beast, carrying with it the acrid stench of melting rubber and charred metal that clawed at your throat even from a distance. A sensory assault that rooted you in the moment's grim tableau. You leaned forward in the loader's perch, the sling creaking faintly, as the driver eased the tank onward, but the sight commanded attention. An olive-drab hull now blackened, the white star insignia bubbling and peeling like forgotten promises under the heat's merciless gaze. History whispered of such scenes as commonplace in Normandy's push, where Shermans fell to hidden 88s or Fausts at rates that turned battalions into pyres, their propensity for catastrophic fires earning the Ronson label not as jest, but as epitaph. A lighter's reliability twisted into wartime irony. Yet, as your own Sherman approached, the flame's dance felt predestined, a mirror held up to the fragility you carried within, where one errant shell could transform steel's sanctuary into blazing tomb, linking your path to the inexorable cycle of loss that defined the advance. The crew fell silent as the spectacle drew nearer, the engine's hum the only underscore to the crackling inferno, where hatches gaped open like screaming mouths, empty of the men who once filled them. Perhaps escaped, perhaps not. Their fates dissolved into the smoke that now stained the horizon. Sarge averted his eyes first, focusing on the road ahead, with that stoic detachment honed by prior ghosts. But you couldn't look away, the fire's hypnotic flicker drawing you in, illuminating the stark reality that this wreck was kin to your own ride. Its ammo racks likely detonated in a chain reaction that history documented with clinical detachment, claiming crews in seconds amid the bocage's unforgiving confines. The bowgunner whispered something unintelligible, his youthful features paling, while the gunner gripped his wheels tightly, as if steadying against an invisible recoil. Linking this visual scar to the deeper wound was the unspoken imagining. each of you, in that hushed passage, picturing yourselves within those flames, the heat searing flesh before senses could fully register, a collective vision that hung heavy in the air like the smoke itself, evoking an empathy for the anonymous souls whose end now served as roadside sentinel. A reminder that survival was not merit but lottery, much like how modern misfortunes strike without warning, demanding a resilience that honors the past's quiet sufferers with grateful reflection. The driver accelerated subtly, the tracks churning faster through the mud, as if to outpace the image, but the wreck's pull lingered, its flames casting elongated shadows that danced across your hull like accusatory fingers, pointing to the vulnerabilities etched into the Sherman's design. Thin sides prone to penetration, fuel tanks that wept under impact, turning escapes into races against ignition. You swallowed against the rising bile, the scent infiltrating the vents now, a pervasive reminder of diesel's dual nature as lifeblood and accelerant. History tallying over 3,000 such burnouts in the European theatre alone, where crews learned to bail at the first whiff of smoke, their drills a desperate bid against the inevitable. In the acceleration's subtle urgency lay a mechanism of coping, the crew bearing the sight beneath layers of forward motion, focusing on the immediate, the next turn, the engine's steady thrum, rather than dwell on the inexorable, where contemplation could unravel the fragile thread holding dread at bay. And as the wreck receded in the periscope's mirror, a wry undercurrent surfaced in the silence. That blaze outshone any Michelin star, guiding the way for enemy spotters with its infernal glow. A fleeting musing born from the edge, where desperation twisted horror into detached absurdity, underscoring the war's satirical cruelty in pitting men against machines that betrayed them as readily as foes. The emotional residue clung like the smoke's residue on your uniform, a palpable weight that deepened the melancholy haze within the tank, where the white walls now seemed mocking in their pristine illusion, unable to shield against the mind's darker wanderings. Sarge broke the quiet with a low command to check the racks, diverting hands to tasks that grounded the abstract fear in tangible action. But the image persisted, a spectral companion whispering of the brew-up phenomenon that claimed so many, where a single hit ignited the ammo in a fireball that history captured in grainy photos and survivor accounts, turning tanks into beacons that lit the night for miles. You complied mechanically, fingers tracing the shell's contours, each one a latent spark in this powder keg existence, and felt the fear evolve, seeping into thoughts like ink into paper, staining the psyche with what-ifs that no drill could erase. Linking this internal storm to the crew's shared glance was the unspoken dread of burning alive, a fate worse than quick ends, where senses lingered in agony amid the flames, evoking profound sympathy for those who met it, their sacrifices the unseen mortar binding the Allied push, much like how today's hidden struggles forge unspoken bonds, stirring gratitude for lives where such fires are metaphorical, navigated with the balm of historical insight. As the road straightened momentarily, the bocage reclaiming its grip on either side, the coping deepened into ritual, the gunner polishing a lens with unnecessary fervor, the bow gunner fidgeting with his belt feed, distractions that wove a fragile veil over the wreck's memory. Yet the smoke scent lingered, a sensory ghost that refused exorcism. History noted this psychological toll as integral to the campaign's grind, where sightings of brewed-up comrades eroded morale faster than enemy fire, forcing commanders to rotate units lest despair take root like the hedgerows themselves. You exhaled slowly, the air thick with unspoken communion, and pondered the destined irony. The Sherman, symbol of industrial triumph, carried within it the seeds of its own spectacular demise, a design flaw that demanded crews confront mortality not in battle's heat, but in these reflective pauses, where the mind's theatre replayed the flames in endless loops. The driver muttered something about pressing on, his acceleration a silent decree to outrun the spectre. A companion in the dim, where fear's quiet persistence mirrored life's own lingering shadows, fostering a deep connection to the past's haunted warriors, whose endurance amid such visions illuminates the value of present peace. Twilight deepened the bocage's hues, casting the road in somber tones, where the wreck's afterimage faded, but its essence endured, a catalyst for the crew's internalized reckonings that history glossed over in favor of tactical maps. Sarge lit a cigarette in the cupola, the flare brief and defiant, and as you watch the smoke curl upward, innocent compared to the wreck's plume, a subtle reflection emerged. In a war of attrition, these roadside torches served as grim lighthouses, warning of perils ahead, while illuminating the absurd fragility of progress, where each loss fueled the resolve to continue, echoing into eras where knowledge of such costs breeds appreciation for the unburnt paths we tread. The tank rolled on, the bocage's walls closing once more, and in the gathering dark, the fear settled into a profound ache, a testament to human tenacity that binds generations in quiet solidarity. The field edged out from the bocage's clutches like a reluctant revelation, a brief expanse of open ground where the sun pierced the overcast veil, casting long shadows that stretched toward the horizon as if fleeing some unspoken doom. There, at the far ridge, a shape materialized, low, wide and menacing, its sloped form hunkering against the earth like a predator coiled in ambush. The German panther emerging from camouflage with the inevitability of a storm cloud swallowing the sky. You froze in the loader's perch, the sling's canvas digging into your back as the tank's periscope framed this nightmare in stark clarity. The long 75mm Kochage 42 gun traversing slowly, its barrel a spear forged in precision's cold forge, capable of punching through your hull from over a kilometer with contemptuous ease. History would frame this encounter as emblematic of the armored disparity. The Panther's 80mm frontal armor angled to deflect blows that shattered lesser foes, a product of desperate Reich engineering that produced only 6,000 units against the Allies' tidal wave. Yet here it loomed as destiny incarnate, a steel apparition that turned the Sherman's modest profile into a fragile silhouette, where one shot could unravel the thin thread binding you to tomorrow. Sarge's voice sliced through the tension, low and edged with the gravity of recognition. Gunner, AP, front slope, linking the crew's suspended breath to the frantic mechanics of response, his words a tether in the gathering void. The Iowa farm boy at the sights steadied his hands, those same fingers that once guided plows now aligning the 75mm tube with mathematical prayer, the turret whining as it swung toward the beast. You hoisted an armor-piercing shell, its weight a cold anchor in the rising panic, slamming it home with a resonant thud that echoed the heartbeat thundering in your ears. The gun barked, the recoil shoving the Sherman backward like a rebuked child, the tracer streaking across the field in a desperate arc, only to strike the Panther's glacis and ricochet harmlessly into the dirt with a hopeless ping, a sound that resonated like the hollow echo of a plea denied. Dread bloomed in that instant as the Panther's turret continued its inexorable pivot, its gun seeking you out with the patience of a judge rendering verdict. history's scales tipping toward the superior design that outranged and out-armored, forcing Allied crews into roles of evasion rather than confrontation. The disparity hung heavy. The Panther's form dwarfing your own in predatory elegance, its interleaved wheels and Christie suspension, allowing it to glide where your tank wallowed. A historical advantage born from lessons in the East now applied to Normandy's patchwork fields. You reloaded instinctively, fingers numb yet driven by the muscle memory of drills. But the fear deepened. Not explosive terror, but a profound seeping chill. As if the air itself thickened with the weight of imbalance, where your 75mm 2,030 feet per second muzzle velocity paled against the KWK's 3,000 talons. Shells that could core a Sherman at ranges where retaliation was mere gesture. Sarge barked again. Reverse, reverse, pop smoke. His command weaving urgency into action. The driver throwing levers as the tank lurched backward, tracks churning soil into frantic sprays while you shifted to smoke rounds, their bursts blooming ahead like ethereal veils, obscuring the field in a hazy shroud that brought fleeting mercy. Another Sherman from the platoon edged laterally, its movement a silent pact of mutual sacrifice, drawing the Panther's attention as it sought a flank shot on the thinner side armor, where 45mm might yield to penetration. A tactic history lauded as the equalizer, swarming the elite with the expendable. Yet in the smoke's swirling embrace, it felt like a desperate gambit, linking your fate to the collective, where individual valor dissolved into the arithmetic of numbers. The Panther fired, its report a thunderclap that shook the ground, the shell whistling past close enough to feel its heat distort the air, slamming into the earth behind with a geyser of dirt that rained upon the hull like accusatory fragments. You exhaled raggedly, the interior thick with the bitter tang of propellant, as the gunner muttered adjustments, his steady hands belying the storm within. The farm boy's composure a quiet defiance against the beast's supremacy. Dread coiled tighter, evoking the melancholy of mismatch. The Sherman, born of assembly lines that prioritized volume over perfection, now facing a foe crafted with artisanal menace, history's irony playing out in this field, where American industry clashed with German precision, stirring empathy for crews ensnared in similar asymmetries across time, where survival demanded ingenuity from inequality, fostering gratitude for eras where such confrontations yield to balanced dialogues. As smoke thickened, veiling the Panther's outline, a subtle reflection flickered. Your shell had bounced like a suitor's proposal spurned, stinging briefly, but not fatally. At least the rejection was swift. Unlike the lingering ache of outmatched dreams, an organic wryness emerging from the precipice where desperation twisted futility into fleeting solace. Escape hinged on the platoon's coordination, your tank retreating into the bocage's folds while the flanking Sherman pressed, its own gun barking in challenge, seeking the Panther's vulnerable rear where armor thinned to 40mm a minute. A weak point history exploited in countless engagements that turned the tide through encirclement rather than direct duel. The Panther traversed again, its shot going wide in the confusion, the smoke's deception granting reprieve as your driver navigated backward with gritted teeth, the hole scraping roots that clawed like fingers reluctant to release. You loaded another round, the action mechanical yet laced with the profound ache of vulnerability, where the encounter underscored the Sherman's role not as conqueror, but as bait in a larger hunt, a destined part in the symphony of swarm tactics that overwhelmed through persistence. The sadness deepened in the retreat's hush, fear a companion that whispered of mortality's caprice. evoking profound sympathy for those who face such nightmares in forgotten fields. Their quiet fortitude a bridge to present reflections where knowledge tempers imbalance with wisdom. The field receded as the bocage reclaimed you, the panther's silhouette fading into the haze, its threat unresolved but momentarily thwarted. History noting such skirmishes as the grind that bled the Wehrmacht dry, where one panther might claim 5 Shermans but succumb to the 6th. You slumped against the breach, the adrenaline's ebb leaving a hollow resonance, and pondered the encounter's weight. The step towards some irrevocable turning, where dread's shadow lengthened, but so did the resolve forged in its depths, linking the past's desperate dances to modern trials, where facing giants demands not strength but strategy, stirring a melancholic thankfulness for the lessons etched in such confrontations. The tank rolled on, the bocage's walls closing once more, and in the gathering twilight, the wry essence persisted. You'd stared into the abyss, and it blinked first, though its gaze promised encores, a subtle musing that wove humour's thread through despair's fabric, illuminating the human capacity to endure with grace amid the absurd. The crossroads lay exposed under a bruised sky, its paths converging like veins in a weathered hand, a nexus where fortunes twisted and alliances frayed, binding your unit to its defence amid the bocage's retreating haze. Directives crackled over the ether, anchoring the platoon to this pivotal vein, where fields met shadowed fringes, the Sherman nestled behind hasty ramparts of uprooted soil and splintered timber. Shells scarce as fleeting hopes lined the compartments, their metallic sheen a dim echo of earlier abundance, each one a calculated wager against the encroaching gale, a German riposte aiming to sever the Allied thrust. You arranged the remnants with measured intent, the atmosphere laden with the tacit reckoning of shortage, where every projectile embodied not mere ordnance, but a slender prolongation of defiance. Chronicles of the era would etch these defences as crucial pivots in the drive inland, where such intersections became forges of resolve, exacting tolls that shifted equilibria through erosion's harsh tally. But in that waning light, it resonated as foreordained, a juncture where mortal determination grappled with conflict's dispassionate machinery. Strain wound tight within the enclosure, the power plant murmuring softly to veil the group's rising disquiet. Sarge framed in the hatchway, surveying the verge for initial stirrings of advance. Figures in Feldgrau darted at the margins, Teutonic foot soldiers pressing beneath twilight's cloak, their outlines merging with the dimming glow like spectres hesitant to solidify, backed by the far-off snarl of mechanized aid. Maybe an assault gun or graver, a feline silhouette skulking in the murk. The forward marksman clutched his station, inhalations shallow, as the aimer recited bearings into the void, his rural poise eroding subtly amid alerts resounding across the link. Adversaries testing, drawing near swiftly. You steadied, the harness a tenuous seat in this metallic vault, sensing the burden of scarcity, the holders partially vacant, a resonant trace of provisioning woes that hindered the surge, where rearward miracles from artificial ports scarcely matched depletion's ravenous demand. As initial salvos peppered the ether, tethering remote menaces to pressing hazard, a subdued musing arose. This guardianship transcended acclaim, a vigil where perseverance echoed existence's safeguards against invading emptiness, awakening a deep affinity with guardians of akin barriers in calmer epochs, where watchfulness shaped the invisible bases of advancement. The onslaught surged abruptly, a tide of ash-hued forms bursting from the thicket, their cries subdued by the terrain's moist curtain, automatic fire rattling in frenzied bursts that scarred the ground encircling your stance. Sarge's directive pierced keenly. Aimer, frag on that cluster, port side, impelling you into flux, lifting a bursting charge from the holder with palms damp from tension, thrusting it forward with a resounding impact that mirrored the pulse echoing in your temples. The barrel thundered, kickback propelling the frame rearward like a scorned entity, the projectile erupting among the assailants in a flourish of debris and vapor that dispersed shapes like foliage in fool's fury. Counter volleys escalated, projectiles ricocheting from the front slope with persistent spite, the forward shooter releasing torrents of luminous paths that curved into the melee, quelling progresses that era's logs enumerated in multitudes during these frantic guards, where Teutonic retorts strive to recapture terrain yielded in the preliminary rush. Munitions waned additionally, each discharge a purposeful selection, binding the group's accuracy to the wider anguish, where Confederate steadfastness abraded the opponent's select through unremitting force, awakening a sorrowful respect for the unswerving essence that transformed such nodes into emblems of determination, akin to how present-day nodes require firmness amid change, awakening appreciation for the equilibrium derived from former offerings. A weightier vibration announced the ironclad's advent, a Teutonic vehicle grinding into sight at the meadow's border, its contour squat and rapacious, cannon pivoting with automated certainty toward your revealed edge. Apprehension climaxed, the confines saturating with the odor of alarm perspiration and heated alloy. As Sarge voiced corrections, the aimer orienting for a frantic volley that chronicles frequently judged ineffective against exalted adversaries, yet propelled by the compulsion of resistance. You charged rapidly, the projectile's insertion a ceremony of conclusion amid shrinking reserves, the barrel's roar dispatching it hurtling toward the menace, colliding with a blaze that marred but failed to vanquish, the foe responding with a projectile that veered narrowly, embedding in the barrier with a seismic thud. Foot troops advanced nearer, explosives soaring like ominous portents, detonating in cascades of fragments that probed the frame's fortitude, the forward shooter exclaiming as shards discovered openings, his locale a whirl of agony and tenacity. Binding this barrage to the group's unraveling cohesion was the invading weariness, where each repulsion chipped at the essence, awakening compassion for those trapped in comparable blockades through ages, where maintaining terrain signified the subdued valor that supports existence's account, awakening recognition for the equilibrium woven from such fiery strands. The ruinous strike arrived sans ceremony, a shrill wail proclaiming the projectile's descent as it crashed into the Sherman's flank, the structure warping with a ferrous moan that echoed through your nucleus, vapor surging inward in suffocating surges infused with the pungent reek of fuel mist and singed circuits. Warning screamed in your consciousness if not aloud, the confines brimming with fog that irritated vision and respiration, the forward shooter drooping further, vital fluid blending with the turmoil as ignition's harbinger, scalding emanations, suggested the conflagration's imminent clasp. Sarge's cry penetrated the uproar. Evacuate. She's concluding prematurely, with compensation dispersed in blaze. His utterance a flicker of obscured buoyancy amid the decline, arisen from the chasm where mirth grappled against frenzy's surge, binding the group's disintegration to a frenzied dash for portals. You paused, the aimer exclaiming objective, as he discerned an adversary emplacement harrying comrades, his tone a filament of rebellion in the dissolving, urging you to drive one final charge home, the lock securing with ultimacy as the barrel bellowed anew, annihilating the peril in a rebellious eruption that preserved concealed existences at the expense of your haven. Evacuation merged into reflex. portals hurled wide as you plunged into the trench, hauling the injured amid caustic mist and snapping warmth. The Sherman igniting aft in a bonfire that lit the junction like a sacrificial signal. Blazes consuming what chronicles would enumerate as another metric in the drive's levy. Ache and vapour obscured sight, but the deed endured. An ultimate barrage arisen from anguish's anvil, where hazard surpassed self, resounding the bravery that converted such pinnacles into shifts, awakening deep linkage to the period's sentinels whose forfeitures enlighten contemporary steadfastness. The gloom engulfed the inferno, abandoning coals and resonances, a sorrowful witness to perseverance's toll, where appreciation swells for the harmony interlaced from such incandescent filaments. The ditch cradled you like a reluctant saviour, its muddy embrace cold and unyielding as you dragged the bow gunner to safety, his weight heavy with the blood-soaked burden of survival, while behind you, lucky lady, burned with a ferocity that lit the Normandy dusk like a fallen star. Flames roared from her hatches, devouring the hull in a crackling dirge, the white star on her flank melting into blackened scars, a final testament to the Sherman's grim nickname whispered in barracks, Ronson, ever faithful to spark on the first strike. You stumbled backward, breath ragged, the air thick with diesel fumes and the acrid bite of scorched steel, your eyes locked on the pyre that had been your refuge, now a monument to the crossroads' brutal toll. History would tally such losses in cold numbers. Over 4,000 Shermans consumed in Europe's grind, many in moments like this, where a single hit ignited the ammo racks into catastrophic blooms. But in the flickering light, it felt fated. A requiem for a machine that carried you through the bocage's maze, only to surrender to fire's relentless hunger. As you steadied the wounded gunner, his groans a faint echo against the inferno's roar. A profound melancholy settled, linking your escape to the countless others who fled similar blazes, their stories etched into the earth's memory, stirring gratitude for the fragile peace of later eras, where such fires burn only in recollection. The platoon's remnants regrouped in the shadows, figures silhouetted against the glow, faces blackened with soot and exhaustion, their silence a shared elegy for the machine and the moment. Sarge knelt beside the bow gunner, binding wounds with strips torn from a uniform already frayed by weeks of wear, his hands steady despite the tremor in his gaze, a quiet acknowledgement of the cost borne by those who held the line. You slumped against a shattered tree stump, the ground cold beneath you, and watched as the flames dwindled, leaving a skeletal husk where dreams of home once huddled in the confines of steel. The advance had held, the crossroads secured for now, but victory tasted of ash, a historical truth woven into the Normandy campaign's fabric, where each gain exacted a toll in metal and men, forcing survivors to press onward with the ghosts of the fallen trailing like smoke. Linking this loss to the broader saga was the crew's unspoken bond, forged not in triumph, but in the raw act of enduring, a resilience that mirrored modern struggles, where perseverance through loss shapes the contours of progress, evoking a deep empathy for those who bore such weights in forgotten fields. As dawn crept over the horizon, its pale light revealed a new procession, fresh Shermans rolling from the rear, their hulls pristine under a fresh coat of olive drab, tracks grinding with mechanical innocence as they advanced to fill the gaps left by their incinerated kin. Beside them marched replacements, their faces unlined by the bocage's cruelties, eyes wide with the naive hope you once carried, now dulled in your own reflection by the smoke's lingering sting. You watch them pass, a relentless tide of steel and youth, history's engine churning forward, with the same industrial inevitability that produced 49,000 Shermans to drown the Axis in numbers, a strategy of attrition that cared little for the individual souls it consumed. Sarge stood, wiping blood from his hands, and nodded toward the advancing column, his voice low with a shadowed edge. War's like a diner, burns one dish, serves another fresh off the grill, no matter how scorched the last one got. The wry musing hung in the morning chill, born from the abyss where despair twisted into dark humor. A fleeting acknowledgement of the cycle's absurdity, where loss was merely a prelude to renewal. Yet each iteration carved deeper scars into those who endured. The march back to the rear unfolded in silence, boots trudging through mud that clung like memories. The weight of survival a heavier burden than the gear slung across your shoulders. The bull gunner limped, supported by the driver, whose Brooklyn bravado softened into a quiet vigilance, while the gunner trailed behind, his steady hands now idle, clutching a rag that had polished sights no longer needed. History would note this retreat as a tactical regrouping, a necessary pause in the push towards Saint-Lô, but it felt like a surrender to the inexorable, where each step westward carried the echo of the crossroads fire, a reminder that war's hunger devoured without discrimination. Linking this withdrawal to the crew's frayed unity was the unspoken resolve to persist, a thread woven through the ages, where survival demanded not just courage, but the quiet fortitude to rise again, stirring a gratitude for the present, where such cycles are metaphors navigated with the wisdom of historical reflection rather than blood-soaked strides. The rear lines offered no respite, only the churn of logistics, trucks unloading crates, medics tending wounds, and the ceaseless hum of preparation that pulsed like a heartbeat through the Allied machine. You stood among the remnants, watching as a new Sherman was assigned, its hull unscarred, its interior still smelling of factory paint rather than sweat and fear, a blank canvas awaiting the marks of your next dance with fate. The bow gunner, patched but pale, leaned against a crate, his youth hardened by the night's ordeal, while Sarge surveyed the new machine with a gaze that held no illusions, knowing it too could become a torch under the bocage's unforgiving verdict. The cycle's relentlessness struck deep, a historical constant where men and machines were fed into the grinder, their sacrifices the unseen mortar of victory, evoking profound sympathy for those caught in its churn, their endurance a testament to the human spirit's refusal to break, mirroring modern battles where persistence through loss carves paths to brighter tomorrows. As you climbed aboard the new tank, the interior's pristine walls felt alien, their whiteness a stark contrast to the memories scorched into your mind, where the ghost of Lucky Lady lingered like a shadow cast across time. The engine roared to life, its vibrations a familiar pulse, yet the act of returning felt fated, a loop where survival was not an end, but a prelude to another trial. History's wheel turning without pause, demanding fresh offerings for the advance. You settled into the loader's station, the sling of familiar discomfort, and pondered the truth. The war cared not for your escape, only for the seats you'd fill again, a cycle that bound you to comrades past and present, stirring a quiet appreciation for the freedoms forged in such crucibles, where each loss fueled the resolve to continue. The tank rolled forward, the bocage awaiting, and in the dim light, a wry reflection flickered. The war's appetite was insatiable, but so was the human will to endure, a subtle irony that wove humor's thread through despair's fabric, illuminating the legacy of those who pressed on despite the flames. As the embers of Lucky Lady fade into Normandy's dusk, we've walked through mud, fire, and the bocage's shadowed heart, where men in fragile steel defied fate's relentless churn. Their courage, etched in smoke and sacrifice, whispers resilience across time, a quiet lullaby for restless souls. Now let your shoulders soften, your breath ease, and your body sink into the night's gentle cradle, ready for sleep's embrace. If your eyes linger open, share a thought below. What echoes of this tale stir you? Tomorrow, another story waits, woven from history's threads to guide you through the dark. For now, let the stars above Normandy hold vigil, their glow a soft promise of rest. Close your eyes, drift gently, and let the night carry you home, where dreams weave peace from the past's enduring grace. Sleep well until we meet again.